The rain fell upon the cobbled streets of London with the grim persistence of a creditor, turning the filth of the gutters into a black, oily river. Inside a narrow townhouse on a street that had seen better days, and worse, Miss Eleanor Vane sat with her hands folded in her lap, the cheap bombazine of her dress as rough as the life her aunt had forced upon her. "I said you will stand straight," Aunt Prudence hissed, her voice a file against Eleanor's nerves. She was a woman of formidable presence, built of whalebone and vinegar, her small eyes gleaming with avarice. "The Duke of Blackmoor does not appreciate slouching. He is to arrive within the hour, and I will not have you ruin the transaction with your sullen face." Eleanor's jaw tightened. The word transaction had been employed before. It was, in fact, the precise word her aunt had used when she had sold Eleanor's mother's pearl brooch, the last remnant of a gentler life, to pay for the roof that now leaked. It was the word used for the silver candlesticks, the good linens, and finally, it would seem, for Eleanor herself. "He is a man of great fortune and greater mystery," her aunt continued, packing the threadbare carpet. "They say he is a monster, disfigured in the wars. They say he keeps to his estates in the north because society cannot stomach the sight of him. They say his temper is blacker than his name, and he has paid a king's ransom for a bride of gentle birth, no matter her lack of dowry." The injustice of it burned like a hot coal in Eleanor's chest. To be sold by a woman who was supposed to be her guardian, a woman who had promised a dying sister to care for her child. Yet here she was, bartered like a prized heifer at market. "And if I refuse?" Eleanor asked, her voice low and steady. She had learned long ago that tears were useless against her aunt's cruelty. Prudence paused, a thin, cruel smile touching her lips. "Refuse. You have no choice, girl. Refuse, and you are out on the street. Refuse, and I shall ensure every respectable house in London knows you are a thief and a liar. You will be grateful for the attentions of any man, let alone a duke. You are 23, penniless and past the bloom of youth. You are dead weight. This is your only chance for survival." The words, cold and pragmatic as a banker's ledger, sealed her fate. Eleanor knew she was a prisoner. She had no resources, no friends, no one to champion her. Her life was a series of closed doors. And now the final door was opening to reveal a creature her aunt called a monster. A heavy knock echoed from the front hall, shaking the dust from the sconces. Eleanor's stomach churned. He was here, the Duke of Blackmoor, the monster. The butler, a man nearly as decrepit as the house itself, opened the door. A gust of cold, rain-laden air swept into the hallway, extinguishing the tentative flames of the candles. Then he filled the doorway. He was not the creature Eleanor had imagined. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in such severe black that he seemed to absorb the light from the room. His features were sharply hewn, aristocratic, but cold as marble. A thin, white scar ran from his temple into his dark hair, a testament to the wars her aunt had spoken of. His eyes were the most alarming part, a startling, clear gray, like winter ice, and they were assessing her without a flicker of emotion. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was not a shout, but a deep, resonant command that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "I am Blackmoor." He did not offer pleasantries. He did not bow. He simply stood, a pillar of dark authority, and watched her. Eleanor, summoning every ounce of her courage, rose to her feet and performed a stiff curtsy. "Your Grace." Her aunt was simpering now, a grotesque parody of hospitality. "Your Grace, how honored we are. This is a humble home for such a distinguished guest. Please do come in. Eleanor, fetch His Grace some refreshment." Blackmoor raised a single-gloved hand. "That will not be necessary." His gaze had not left Eleanor. It was a disconcerting sensation, as if he could see through the frayed fabric of her dress, through her skin, to the terror and fury churning beneath. "I have come to conclude our business and depart. The contracts have been drawn. I have brought the final documents for your signature, madam." His words were for her aunt, but his eyes never left Eleanor's face. He produced a heavy envelope from his coat and handed it to Prudence, who snatched it with indecent haste. "The arrangements are simple," Blackmoor continued, his voice a cold, even monotone. "She will travel north to Blackmoor Hall at week's end. A carriage and an escort will be provided. Upon her arrival, the marriage will take place in the estate chapel. As agreed, she will want for nothing. Her duty is to her station, not to the whims of a husband." Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her. He spoke of her as a piece of furniture, an obligation. The chill emanating from him was a physical force. This was not a man offering kindness. This was a man making a purchase. As he turned to leave, his great coat swirling about his tall form, he paused at the door. He looked back at Eleanor, and for the first time something in his icy gaze softened, a hairline crack in the marble facade. "Have you not a cloak, Miss Vane?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. The question was so absurdly unexpected, so jarringly personal in the midst of this cold transaction, that Eleanor was struck dumb. She shook her head. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy black cloak from his own shoulders. In 2 strides he was before her and he draped it over her. The garment was shockingly heavy, infused with the scent of horse, leather, and the faint, clean spice of sandalwood. It was warm from his body. For a man who radiated cold, he was a furnace. "The house has a draft," was all he said, before turning on his heel and disappearing into the storm, leaving Eleanor standing in the dim hallway, draped in his cloak, her heart hammering a frantic, bewildered rhythm against her ribs. The cloak remained in Eleanor's possession. Her aunt, blinded by the substantial draft on her bank, had not even noticed the fine black wool still draped over the back of the chair in Eleanor's tiny, cold room. Eleanor had touched it often in the days that followed, that heavy, masculine garment, remembering the searing warmth of it and the strange, unfathomable look in the Duke's winter-gray eyes. It was the single act of consideration, however fleeting, that anyone had shown her in 5 years, and it terrified her. The week was a blur of forced smiles, her aunts bragging to envious neighbors and the cold dread of the approaching journey. Eleanor was not permitted to pack her own meager belongings. Instead, her aunt provided a trunk filled with cheap, gaudy fabrics, proclaiming that a duke's wife must not appear a pauper. The gowns were ill-fitting and stiff, constructed for vanity, not comfort. On the appointed day, a grand, dark-paneled carriage emblazoned with the Blackmoor crest, a raven, wings outspread, drew up to the townhouse. 2 outriders and a coachman, all in severe black livery, accompanied it. There was no sign of the Duke. Eleanor, wearing a scratchy crimson traveling gown that made her look pale and hollow, climbed into the plush interior. The carriage was a palace of leather and polished wood, a stark, silent contrast to the world she knew. As the door closed, she did not look back at the townhouse where her youth had died. She looked forward into the unknown. The journey north was an eternity of rain-soaked countryside and leaden skis. The coachman was silent, the outriders were stone-faced. She was a prisoner being transported to a life sentence. The only texture in the monotony was the changing landscape, the neat, civilized fields of the south giving way to wilder, bleaker country. Rolling hills became craggy fells. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. This was Blackmoor country, harsh and untamed. They traveled for 3 days. Each night they stopped at coaching inns where rooms were already reserved, meals were already paid, and the locals stared at the Blackmoor carriage with a mixture of respect and fear. The name, Eleanor realized, was a powerful and isolating force. She was not Eleanor Vane, she was an appendage of the Blackmoor estate. At last, as dusk swallowed the land on the 3rd day, the carriage turned through a pair of immense iron gates, upon which 2 stone ravens stood sentinel. They proceeded down a long avenue of ancient oaks, their bare branches clawing at the bruised purple sky. Then the castle rose before her. It was not a stately home in the Palladian style. It was a fortress, a hulking medieval edifice of dark gray stone that seemed to grow out of the very rock of the crag it commanded. Towers and battlements clawed at the sky, and the sheer scale of it was overwhelming. A single, long line of light glowed from a row of arched windows, illuminating the teeth of the portcullis. Blackmoor Hall was not a home. It was a statement of power, a monument to an ancient, unforgiving lineage. The carriage clattered into a vast cobbled courtyard. Servants materialized from the shadows, silent and efficient. The great oak doors of the keep swung open, and a man in the austere dress of a butler stepped forward. "Miss Vane," he said with a deep bow, "welcome to Blackmoor Hall. His Grace is in the great hall and awaits your arrival." Eleanor's legs were stiff and uncertain as she descended from the carriage, the crimson of her dress looking garish and wrong against the cold gray stone. She was led through a labyrinth of vast, echoing corridors hung with portraits of long-dead Blackmoors. Their painted eyes followed her, filled with the same cold, assessing scrutiny she had seen in the Duke. Suits of armor stood like silent guards, and the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, ancient stone, and something else, a metallic, smoky scent that clung to the walls. The great hall was cavernous. A roaring fire in a hearth the size of a small room cast dancing shadows on tapestries and a long trestle table. At the far end, before the fire, stood the Duke. He was not in the severe black of London. He wore a simple white shirt, open at the collar, dark breeches, and high leather boots. The firelight cut across the sharp planes of his face, and his scar seemed more pronounced, a silver slash against his skin. He looked less like a peer of the realm and more like a warrior in his keep. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. The servants vanished. The great door boomed shut, sealing them in. Eleanor stood alone in the center of the hall, a small, crimson figure in a fortress of shadow and stone. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the immense presence of him from across the room. He did not move. He simply stood by the fire, a goblet of wine in his hand, his figure outlined by the flames. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "You are tired," he said finally. It was not a question. His voice was softer here, less of a command, but it still held the power to make her tremble. "The journey is long, and you are not dressed for the cold of the north." Eleanor flinched, acutely aware of the absurd, thin crimson gown. "It was all I was given," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke set his goblet down on the stone hearth with a soft click. He took a step toward her and then another. The firelight caught the gray of his eyes, making them glimmer like molten silver. She saw then what she had been too terrified to notice in London. It was not just coldness in his eyes. It was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, a burden, dark and heavy, that he carried alone. "I did not choose this," he said, his words low and raw. The confession hung in the air between them, a stark and startling revelation from a man who seemed to have no need for truths. Eleanor stared at him, her own fear warring with a surge of unexpected emotion. He had not chosen this. Neither had she. They were two people, bound by a contract, trapped in a fortress of his making. Before she could reply, he turned away, back to the fire. "The housekeeper will show you to your chambers. We marry at noon. Your only duty is to be present." He paused, his voice turning hard again. "And Miss Vane, do not mistake my moment of honesty for weakness. I am not a kind man. I am a man with a debt to pay, and you are the price." His words were a dagger, but they were thrown at the fire, not at her. And in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, Eleanor saw not a monster, but a man holding himself together by the thinnest of threads. The night passed in a fog of sleeplessness. Eleanor lay in a vast, canopied bed in a chamber that was elegantly appointed but cold as a tomb. The tapestries on the walls seemed to watch her, their woven figures frozen in ancient hunts and battles. She could still feel the heat of the great hall's fire on her skin, still hear the raw confession of the Duke echoing in her mind. He was not a kind man, and you are the price. Yet, the way he had stood, like a man lashed by an invisible whip, told a different story. At noon she was brought to the estate chapel, a small, jewel-like building within the castle walls. It was a place of cold, colored light, the stained glass windows depicting saints and warriors in equal measure. The air smelled of stone dust and old incense. She wore a gown of white silk, simple and unadorned, provided by the Duke's own staff. It fit her perfectly, another unexpected consideration. The chapel was empty save for the priest, a nervous-looking man with a reedy voice, and the Duke. He stood at the altar, a monument of controlled power in his black coat. He did not look at her as she entered, nor as she walked down the short aisle, her borrowed silk rustling on the stones. He was staring at the altar, his profile as sharp and unmoving as the stone faces of his ancestors. The ceremony was brief and stark. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses beyond the priest. The vows were spoken, their voices echoing in the hollow space. Eleanor's own voice was steady, though her heart was a frantic drum. The Duke's voice was low and even, but when he slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger, his hand was not perfectly steady. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the priest intoned, his voice cracking slightly. The Duke turned to her then, and for the first time he looked directly into her eyes. His gaze was not cold, but searching, intense. He did not kiss her. He simply held her gaze for a long, breathless moment, then turned and offered her his arm. His touch was light, almost formal, but the power of it seemed to burn through the silk of her sleeve. They dined alone that evening in a smaller, more intimate parlor. The grand dining hall would have been absurd for two people. The table was set with silver and crystal, the food was exquisite, but the silence was a physical wall between them. The Duke ate sparingly, his attention seemingly focused on the wine in his glass. Eleanor pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. "You do not eat," he observed, his voice startling in the quiet. "I am not hungry, Your Grace." "Blackmoor," he said, his voice low. "We are married. You may call me Blackmoor or Lucian." The name was a shock, a gift of intimacy she had not expected. "Lucian," she repeated softly, testing the sound of it. He winced, as if the sound of his own name caused him pain. "It was my mother's name for me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Eleanor looked at him, at the scar, at the hard line of his jaw, and saw a boy who had once been loved by a mother. It was a devastating image. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Why did you buy me from my aunt? I am no great beauty, I have no fortune. You could have chosen any heiress in England." The Duke swirled the dark wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on the movement. "Heiresses have families, they have expectations, they ask questions." He took a long drink. "I required a wife who would be content with the name, the station, and the solitude. A wife who would not pry into my affairs. Your circumstances, as I was informed, made you unique." "A wife purchased because she has no choice," Eleanor said, the bitterness of the truth sharp on her tongue. "A wife who is grateful for the scraps from your table." His head snapped up, and for a moment the cold fury she had heard of was there in his eyes. It was a terrifying sight, a storm brewing in that winter gray. "You are mistaken, madam. I did not purchase you to be grateful. I purchased you to be free of the prying eyes of a wife. A business arrangement, nothing more." "Then why?" Eleanor pressed, her own courage flaring in the face of his anger. "Did you give me your cloak when I was cold in my aunt's hall? Why does my chamber have a fire already lit against the chill? Why did you ensure my wedding gown fit me as if made for me? These are not the actions of a man who wants only a business arrangement." He was on his feet, the chair scraping back against the stone floor. He was towering, a figure of immense power and barely contained fury. For a moment, Eleanor thought she had pushed too far, that she would see the monster her aunt had promised. He crossed the room to the window, his back to her. His broad shoulders were rigid. He was silent for a long, agonizing minute. "Because I know what it is to be sold," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper, filled with a pain so profound it seemed to shake the very stones of the castle. "I know what it is to have your life bartered away by those who should have protected you, and I would not wish that cold upon anyone." He turned back to face her, and the mask was gone. Gone was the cold Duke, the commanding monster. In his place was a man stripped raw, his vulnerabilities laid bare for her to see. "I am not a kind man, Eleanor. I am a broken one, and this marriage is my penance." The revelation struck her with the force of a blow. He wasn't a monster. He was a man drowning, and he had just offered her the only piece of himself he had left, his truth. The days at Blackmoor Hall took on a strange, suspended rhythm. Eleanor was a stranger in a world of stone and silence. She was the Duchess of Blackmoor now, a title that seemed to belong to the portraits on the walls, not to her. The servants were respectful, their deference absolute, but they kept their distance, their faces carefully blank. It was as if the entire household was holding its breath. The Duke Lucian was a ghost in his own keep. He spent his days in his study, a fortress of leather and books at the top of the North Tower, or riding the wild moors alone. Eleanor would watch him from the window, a lone black figure on a massive black horse, disappearing into the heather and mist. He was a man fleeing from something, and she was beginning to understand that the something was within himself. The nights were the strangest. They dined together each evening. It was a command, not a request. The first few dinners were excruciating silences. Then slowly Eleanor began to speak. She told him about her childhood before her parents died, of gardens and laughter. She told him of her cruel aunt, but without bitterness, reciting the facts as a historian might. She asked him no questions. He had given her a sliver of his truth, and she knew better than to pry further. But she offered him her own stories, filling the yawning silence of the great hall with the sound of a human voice. He listened. He rarely spoke, but he listened with an intensity that was both flattering and unnerving. His gray eyes would fix on her face, and she felt as if he were memorizing every word, every nuance. Then one evening, a fortnight after their arrival, he spoke. "You rode as a child," he said, a statement, not a question. Eleanor looked up from her soup, surprised. "Yes, I loved it more than anything." "The stables are well stocked," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It would be a shame for the horses to grow fat and lazy. The moors are not safe for a woman alone, but you may take a groom with you." It was a gift, wrapped in the coldness of a command. The next morning Eleanor found a saddle waiting and a gentle gray mare named Willow. The groom, a quiet man named Thomas, followed at a respectful distance. The wind was sharp and clean, the sky a vast, endless blue. As she rode across the moor, the heather a purple blaze beneath her, Eleanor felt a weight lifting from her soul. She was not free, not truly, but for an hour she could breathe. When she returned, flushed and smiling, she found Lucian standing in the courtyard as if he had been waiting. He watched her dismount, his expression unreadable. Then something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of warmth that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It suits you," he said, his voice gruff. He was looking at her hair, which had come loose from its pins and was wild about her shoulders. "The wind." He turned and walked away, leaving her heart hammering in her chest. The fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It was delivered to Eleanor by the butler, on a silver salver. The handwriting was elegant, but the seal was unfamiliar, a serpent coiled around a rose. Her aunt's letters were filled with petty complaints and veiled requests for more money. This was something else entirely. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was from a woman named Lady Seraphina de Vere. The name was vaguely familiar, a famous beauty of the London ton. The words were a careful poison. "My dear Duchess," it read, "how the ton gossips about the mysterious new bride of the formidable Duke of Blackmoor. Some say you are a pauper sold into marriage. Others whisper of darker things. I write to offer my condolences. I knew Lucian once, before the war, before the scandal that broke him. He was a different man then. Capable of great passion, it is true, but also capable of great cruelty. I would caution you, woman, to guard your heart. He will only break it. After all, he broke mine." The letter seared Eleanor's fingers. The air seemed to leave the room. He was capable of great cruelty. He would only break it. The words echoed in her mind. warring with the image of the man who had given her his cloak, who had spoken of being sold, who had given her a horse. The man who was a broken prisoner of his own past. Who was the real Lucian Blackmoor? Was she a wife, or was she simply the latest in a long line of women to be wounded by this dark, enigmatic man? The door to the library opened. Lucian stood there, his eyes going from her stricken face to the letter in her hand. The color drained from his face, leaving his scar stark against his pallor. "What is that?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Eleanor could not speak. She could only hand him the letter. He read it in a single, devouring glance. The paper crumpled in his fist. His face was a mask of fury, but beneath it, Eleanor saw the raw, bleeding wound of the past. "Seraphina," he spat the name a curse. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes blazing. "Do not believe a word of it," he commanded. But there was a tremor in his voice, a desperate plea beneath the demand. "She is a liar and a viper." "Then tell me the truth," Eleanor whispered, her own voice trembling. "Tell me what she means. What scandal? What did you do?" He took a step toward her, then stopped, his body vibrating with tension. He was a man at war with himself. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. "I cannot," he said finally, the words ripped from him. "If I tell you, you will look at me the way the world looks at me, with fear, with disgust, and I cannot bear that, not from you." He turned and fled the room, leaving Eleanor standing alone with the crumpled letter and the shattering realization that her husband, the man she was beginning to fall for, was hiding something so terrible that he believed it would destroy her. The Duke vanished. He did not appear for dinner. The next morning his horse was gone from the stables and the servants wore expressions of grim foreboding. "His Grace has ridden out," was all the butler would say. "He is not expected back." He was punishing himself, Eleanor realized. The letter from Seraphina had been a goad, and he had fled into the wild not from her, but from the man she might see if he told the truth. The vulnerability he had shown in the library, the raw fear in his eyes, was more telling than any confession. The monster her aunt had described would not have feared her judgment. A man terrified of losing her regard was not a monster. He was a man in agony. But she could not live on conjecture. She needed to understand the man she had married. She found her answer not from the Duke, but from the most unlikely of sources. Mrs. Thistle, the ancient, silver-haired housekeeper, had been with the Blackmoor family for over 50 years. She was a woman of few words and deep loyalty. Eleanor sought her out in the vast, warm kitchens, where the scent of baking bread and drying herbs created a haven of normalcy within the cold fortress. "Mrs. Thistle," Eleanor began, her voice gentle, "I need to understand His Grace. I need to know about Lady Seraphina. I need to know what happened before the war." The old woman's hands, kneading dough with surprising strength, stilled. Her eyes, faded blue and sharp, met Eleanor's. For a long moment she was silent. "It is not my place, Your Grace," she said, her voice a low rasp. "I am his wife," Eleanor replied, her voice firm, "and he is in pain. I cannot help him if I do not know the nature of the wound." Mrs. Thistle sighed, a deep, weary sound. "The wound is old, but it festers still." She wiped her floury hands on her apron. "Come with me." She led Eleanor up a narrow spiral staircase, past storage rooms and dusty servants' quarters, to a locked door at the end of a forgotten corridor. She produced a key from a chain at her waist. "I kept it secret, as he commanded," she said, "but perhaps the time for secrets is over." The door opened onto a room that was different from the rest of the castle. It was brighter somehow, even with the curtains drawn. A large portrait hung above a cold fireplace. Eleanor had seen it before, but now she looked at it with new eyes. It was a painting of a family, a handsome, smiling man, a woman of exquisite beauty with dark hair and gray eyes, and a boy of perhaps 12. The boy was laughing, his face open and joyful. It was Lucian, a Lucian she had never met. "His parents," Mrs. Thistle said, her voice thick with memory. "And the young master, before the fire, before the accident that took them." "The fire," Eleanor whispered. A great blaze in the west tower. The old Duke and Duchess were trapped inside. The master tried to save them. He was but a boy of 15. He ran into the flames again and again. That is where he got the scar on his temple and the burns on his back. The marks you have not seen. The marks he hides. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. The scar on his face was only a glimpse of a deeper pain. He had been a boy, a hero, and he had failed. He survived, Mrs. Thistle continued, her voice heavy, but he was never the same. The light went out of him, and then the war took what little remained. She paused, her eyes hardening, and the viper took the rest. Lady Seraphina, Eleanor asked. She was his betrothed, an arrangement made in childhood. He loved her, or thought he did. He was a young man, desperate for any warmth. He confided in her, told her of his nightmares, of his guilt. He thought she understood. The housekeeper's lips curled in disgust. She used it against him. He overheard her one night at a ball, laughing with her friends. She called him a poor, broken thing. She said she only wanted his title, his fortune, and that she would never share a bed with a man whose mind was a charnel house. The cruelty of the betrayal struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She saw the young, grieving boy reaching out for love, only to have his vulnerability weaponized. No wonder he had built walls around his heart. He broke off the engagement, Mrs. Thistle said, but the damage was done. He became the cold, distant Duke the world now knows. He went to war, and when he returned, he was worse. The war broke men's souls. It broke his. Eleanor turned back to the portrait, tears streaming down her face. She looked at the laughing boy, at the loving parents. The keep was not a testament to power. It was a tomb. And Lucian was the ghost, haunting his own life, haunted by the ghosts of those he could not save. "Thank you, Mrs. Thistle," Eleanor said, her voice thick with tears. "Thank you for telling me." She turned and fled the room, her heart aching for the boy in the portrait, for the man he had become. The secret was not a crime. It was a wound, and she had to find him. She had to tell him that she saw him not as a monster, but as the boy who had run into the fire. She found him at dusk, on the edge of a cliff overlooking the churning sea. He stood with his back to the castle, a solitary figure against the vast, gray sky. He did not turn as she approached. "You should not be here," he said, his voice raw. "The cliff is dangerous." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "I came anyway." He turned, and she saw the ruin of him, the exhaustion, the despair, the terrible guilt. It was all there, laid bare in the fading light. "Mrs. Thistle told me," Eleanor said softly. "She showed me the portrait. She told me about the fire, about your parents." His face went white, then dark with fury. She had no right. "She loves you," Eleanor said. "I love you." The words hung in the air, a confession as stark and powerful as the sea below. His eyes widened, the fury draining away, replaced by a naked shock so profound it was almost childlike. "You cannot," he whispered. "You do not know me. You do not know the things I have seen, the things I have done." Eleanor took a step closer, the wind whipping her hair around her face. "I know you are a man who carries a mountain of grief alone. I know you are a man who is kind in the dark when no one is watching. I know you are a man who believes himself unworthy of love." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his scar. "I know you are a man who ran into a fire, and I know that I would run into the fire with you." His hand came up and covered hers, pressing it against his cheek. His gray eyes were liquid, swimming with 1,000 unshed tears. He leaned his forehead against hers, and she felt the shudder that ran through his entire body. "I am broken, Eleanor," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Then we will put the pieces back together," she replied, her own voice choked with tears. "Together." Confession on the cliff changed everything and nothing. The walls did not come tumbling down all at once. They crumbled, stone by stone. The emotional climax of the cliff had been a reckoning, but the path to true intimacy was a slow, painstaking excavation of a soul long buried under guilt and grief. Lucian did not become a different man overnight. He was still a creature of silence and shadow, still prone to long, solitary rides. But there was a shift. He began to seek her out, not for conversation but for presence. He would join her in the library in the evening, sitting in a chair by the fire, reading a book or simply staring into the flames. Eleanor would sit opposite him, working on her embroidery or reading, and the silence between them was no longer a wall but a shared space. A comfortable quiet. He began to touch her, small, tentative gestures that sent shivers through her, a hand at the small of her back as they walked through the garden, his fingers brushing hers as he passed her a cup of tea. Once, he tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his knuckles grazing her cheek, and the heat of that brief contact lingered for hours. He told her about the war, not in grand, heroic tales but in fragments, delivered in a low, haunted voice as they walked the ramparts in the rain. He spoke of the mud, the endless rain, the sounds of men dying. He spoke of the moment he had led his men into a trap and how he had watched them fall. He carried that weight, she understood. He carried it all. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he spoke of the night of the fire. "I can still smell the smoke," he whispered, staring into the flames. "I can hear my mother calling my name." Eleanor did not offer empty platitudes. She simply took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. He held on as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. The arrival of a guest shattered their fragile peace. A letter arrived from her aunt, announcing her imminent visit. She claimed to be concerned for Eleanor's welfare. Eleanor knew better. Her aunt was coming to assess her new investment, to see if there was more to be extracted from the Duke. Eleanor was terrified. Her aunt was a woman who could sniff out vulnerability and exploit it. She would see the delicate bond forming between Eleanor and Lucian, and she would try to poison it. "She cannot come," Eleanor said, her voice frantic. "I will not see her." Lucian's expression was cold. "She is your aunt. It would be improper to refuse her entry, but she will not stay long, I will ensure it." Her aunt arrived in a flurry of silk and insincere smiles. She gushed over the grandeur of Blackmoor Hall, her eyes greedily cataloguing the silver, the art, the sheer scale of the Duke's wealth. At dinner, she dominated the conversation, talking of London gossip and her own imagined importance. "And how is married life, my dear?" she asked Eleanor, her smile sharp. "The Duke is a man of few words. I hope he is not too demanding." The insinuation was clear. Eleanor flushed with anger. "His Grace is a perfect gentleman," she said, her voice clipped. Her aunt's smile widened. "I am so glad to hear it. One hears such stories of these old families. Cold, proud men haunted by the past. But I am sure you have tamed him, haven't you, my dear? Or perhaps he has tamed you." Lucian, who had been silent throughout the meal, set his wine glass down with a sharp click. The room seemed to chill. He fixed her aunt with a gaze of pure ice. "Madam," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you are a guest in this house, but let us be clear. You are not welcome. You sold your niece into marriage like a farmer sells a prize mare. You do not now get to assess the quality of the stable. You will leave in the morning." Her aunt's face went white, then red. "Your Grace, I meant no offense. I am merely concerned for my dear niece's happiness." "Your concern is noted and dismissed," Lucian said, rising to his feet. "Do not test my hospitality further." The next morning her aunt was gone, bundled into a carriage by the Duke's forbidding servants. Eleanor watched from the window, a wave of relief washing over her. He had protected her. He had stood as a wall between her and the cruelty of her past. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching her. "You did not have to be so harsh," she said softly, though she did not mean it. "Yes, I did," he replied, his voice firm. "She is a vulture. She will not touch you again." The vulnerability of the past days had hardened into a fierce protectiveness. This was not the cold Duke, but a man defending what was his, and it made Eleanor love him all the more. That night a fierce storm raged outside the walls of Blackmoor Hall. Rain lashed the windows and the wind howled like a banshee. Eleanor sat in her chamber, listening to the storm, feeling a strange sense of unease. Then she heard a sound, a cry muffled by the wind coming from the Duke's chambers. She hesitated. It was not proper for a wife to enter her husband's chambers unbidden, but the cry came again, a sound of such raw anguish that it overrode all propriety. She took a candle and went out into the dark corridor. She found the door to his chambers ajar. She pushed it open. The room was lit only by the dying embers of a fire. Lucian lay in the vast four-poster bed, tangled in his sheets, his face contorted in the grip of a nightmare. He was crying out, his voice ragged. "Father, Mother, I can't reach them. The flames." Eleanor rushed to his side. She set the candle down and sat on the edge of the bed. "Lucian," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Lucian, wake up. You are dreaming." He did not wake. His body thrashed, his hands clawing at the air. He was fighting the fire again, trapped in the memory. Eleanor, acting on instinct, took his hand. His grip was crushing, but she did not pull away. She held on, anchoring him. "I am here," she whispered. "You are not alone. Come back to me." With a choked gasp, he woke. His eyes flew open, wild and unseeing for a moment. Then they focused on her face, and a great shudder racked his body. He was soaked in sweat, his chest heaving. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice broken. "I am here," she said again. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her with a desperate strength. He held her as if he were drowning. She could feel the frantic hammering of his heart against her own, the heat of his skin through the thin linen of his shirt. She held him, her hand stroking his damp hair, her voice a soft murmur of comfort in the storm. And in the darkness, bound by the storm outside and the tempest within, the last of the walls between them finally crumbled. He was not a duke. She was not a duchess. They were two wounded souls finding refuge in each other. The sun rose over Blackmoor Hall, casting long, golden rays through the mullioned windows, chasing away the shadows of the storm. In the Duke's chambers, Eleanor lay in the crook of Lucian's arm, her head resting on his shoulder. He was awake, his fingers tracing slow, gentle patterns on her back. The nightmare had been a crucible. In its aftermath, there was no formality, no pretense. There was only the quiet miracle of two people who had survived the night together. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper. "I will always stay," she replied, her voice soft against his chest. He shifted, turning to look at her. In the morning light, his gray eyes were clear, the storm in them replaced by a quiet tenderness. He touched her face, his knuckles grazing her cheek. "I have spent my entire life pushing people away," he said, "terrified that if they saw the truth of me, they would run. You saw the very worst of me last night, and you did not flinch." "I saw a man in pain," Eleanor said, her own eyes shining. "I saw the boy who ran into the fire. There is no shame in that, only courage." A sound escaped him, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Courage. I have spent years hiding from my own reflection." "Then stop hiding," she whispered. "Let me see you." He looked at her for a long, breathless moment. Then, with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a deep, abiding love. A pledge. A promise. It was the taste of forgiveness, both given and received. The kiss deepened. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of his body against hers, the taste of his lips, the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. It was a connection born not of obligation, but of a profound and hard-won understanding. The loneliness that had defined both their lives in that moment was finally over. Later, they walked hand in hand through the gardens. The world was washed clean by the rain, and the air was fresh and new. The servants, who had kept a careful distance, now smiled openly. Mrs. Thistle, seeing them from the kitchen window, wiped a tear from her eye. "I want to show you something," Lucian said, leading her away from the formal gardens, towards the wilder edge of the estate where the moors began. They walked until they came to a small, secluded valley, protected from the wind. In the center of the valley stood the ruins of an ancient chapel, older even than the castle. Ivy covered its walls, and wildflowers bloomed around its fallen stones. "This was the family's first home," Lucian said, his voice soft with reverence for the place, not the grand castle, but this humble ruin. "The original Blackmoor built it with his own hands. It was a place of hope, a new beginning." He turned to her, taking both of her hands in his. "The castle is a fortress of my ancestors' making, a monument to their power and their pain. I have been a prisoner there for too long, but this is a place for building, not for hiding. I want to rebuild it, not as a shrine to the past, but as a home for the future." He squeezed her hands. "Our future." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Lucian." "I know I cannot undo the past," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I cannot bring back my parents. I cannot undo the things I saw in the war, but I can choose to live, to love. And I choose you, Eleanor, not as a price paid for a debt, but as the woman who brought light into my darkness." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a love so profound it felt like a physical force. She had been sold, a transaction of the cruelest kind. But in the hands of this mysterious duke, she had not found a monster. She had found a man who had been sold too. And in their shared vulnerability, in the wreckage of their pasts, they had found each other. She reached up and framed his face with her hands, her thumbs tracing the line of his scar, the mark of his courage. "I am not your penance, Lucian," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "And you are not my purchaser. We are not a contract. We are a choice." She smiled, a radiant, watery smile. "I choose you too, every part of you, the shadows and the light. I choose the boy who ran into the fire, and I choose the man who came back from the war." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. The wind whispered through the ruins of the old chapel, a soft, echoing sound that sounded like a blessing. "You have given me back my life," he whispered into her hair, "my heart." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Then let us live it," she said, "together." He smiled then, a true, full smile that transformed his face, erasing the years of sorrow and guilt. In that smile she saw the laughing boy from the portrait, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that the boy was still there, and he always would be. He kissed her again, a long, slow, sweet kiss that tasted of promise and new beginnings. The world was bright around them, the heather blooming purple on the moors, the sun warm on their faces. The cruel transaction that had brought them together had become something else entirely. It had become a triumph of the human heart. It had become a love story. And as they stood together in the ruins of the old chapel, they began to build their future. Not with stone and mortar, but with trust and honesty, with compassion and understanding. The Duke and his Duchess, no longer bound by secrets and silence, but by the greatest power of all. They were bound by love. And against that, no cruelty, no scandal, no shadow of the past could ever stand.